Countless trains have come and gone over the past 2 centuries, with some classes including hundreds of reliable members in working order, while others have been lost to time as fallen legends or faded into obscurity. Yet the least known type of them all are the various engines that never even left the drawing boards, with some classes being minor adjustments to existing ones, while others were megaprojects that would have changed the face of railroading. Today, we'll be looking at some of these canceled designs from some of the greatest manufacturers in this episode of Unbuilt. What better way to start off a brand new series than covering one of the greatest locomotive manufacturers of all time, EMD. This pioneer in diesel technology was established about 100 years ago, as they were initially known as Electromotive Company, or EMC. Around this time, they specialized in doodlebugs, small diesel railcars that carried passenger and freight on lesser used branch lines, but the new locomotive builder would move from marketing and design to building road freight diesels in the late 30s with models such as the EA. But leading up to the development of what would eventually become the most iconic engine of their time, EMC produced a handful of boxy demonstrators that showcased the pulling capability of their prime movers, as well as early stages for experimental designs, as they essentially combined the purpose of the doodlebug and the locomotive into one new diesel. Even though a total of 5 were built, with 2 going to the Santa Fe, 1 to the Baltimore and Ohio, and the other 2 being EMC demonstrators for various railroads, concept art was made to apply a more streamlined variant to these box cabs in 1935. Not much is known about this specific concept, other than being intended for use on the Union Pacific, as it was heavily based on the railroad's recently built M10000 diesel streamliner train set, which was also produced by EMC. Like the other experimental box cabs, this streamlined variant had a cab on both ends, air intake on the top, as well as doors for crew members to walk in between the engines and passenger cars. But unlike their sister engines, these streamlined variants have windows on 3 surfaces, which would have required some pretty tricky welding, and was likely one of a few reasons as to why this engine was never built, as well as EMC preferring the smoother and more successful E-series of diesels. Even though this isn't an unbuilt class of locomotives, it's still included in the episode since the first few EMC box cabs didn't have an official class of their own, and the rounded edges combines the similar concepts of a diesel-powered train set and a diesel locomotive into one versatile design. From the prototyping of the box cabs came the success of the E-series along with various other switchers and mainline road engines, and despite almost every model being a massive success for the next few decades, there were still a handful of examples that were proposed or cataloged that never ended up being built. Many of these classes don't have known concept art, but we do have a general idea of what they would have looked like and what their intended purposes were. Starting from the early box cabs and streamliners, it's only right that we move on to the next series of popular EMD diesels, specifically 4-axle engines. Starting off this segment is a class that unfortunately we know the least about in the whole video, namely the GMDH-2. The only reason as to why it's even included in this episode is due to a brief mention on a list of unbuilt engines on a Trains magazine forum, a list that came in handy for most of the info in this series, but supposedly no further discussion of this class can be found anywhere online. Meanwhile, the 2 classes that supposedly led to the GMDH-2 are the GMDH-1 and GMDH-3, a series of experimental and futuristic-looking center cap shunters built by EMD's Canadian division, GMD, made to rival the GE 44-ton switchers. The former only saw 4 built, while the latter single-engine variant only had 1 member built, with none of these unique classes being notably successful or sold en masse. Therefore, it's assumed that the GMDH-2 would have been a continuation of this style of center cap switchers, either with 4 axles or a different axle amount, but the class was never built in favor of more conventional, widely used switcher models. Similarly, the F-18 and F-20 were offered around the same time as part of EMD's 1959 lineup of new engines, as F-unit variants of the new GP-18 and GP-20 road switchers. This continuation of the iconic mixed-use F-series would be identical to the previous F-9, but the F-18 would have non-turbocharged components of the GP-18, and the F-20 would have turbocharged components of the GP-20. In the end, every railroad that traded in their aging F-3s opted for the more versatile GP-18 and GP-20 due to hood units having easier accessibility to the prime mover, and the lack of interest in passenger engines in general. But just like the previous class, the idea of this unbuilt engine was utilized through different means, as the second batch of dual-mode FL9s were built with GP18 controls and mechanical components, which prompted EMD to consider renaming this batch the FL18, but this name change was never implemented. Moving along to the next wave of new EMD engines in 1966 is the SW750, a class of 4-axle switchers derived from the various SW series engines. Specifically, the SW750 would have contained a 6-cylinder 645 prime mover with an exterior similar to the SW1000, with the low-cab SW751 variant looking identical to the low-cab SW1001. Despite being cataloged along with the SW1000, no orders were made for the class since the 6-cylinder prime mover didn't produce as much horsepower when compared to the 8-cylinder 645 prime mover of the SW1000 and earlier SW900. But had the SW750 been purchased, it would have been the first of countless engines to utilize one of EMD's most reliable prime movers, as they can be found in practically any locomotive built after 1966 and still run strong to this day. Interestingly enough, a 6-cylinder 645 prime mover was eventually built by EMD, specifically for the Victorian Railway's Y-Class diesel, as EMD's Australian exports were heavily based on American counterparts. Towards the end of the 4-axle segment of unbuilt EMD engines, we're skipping all the way to 1980 with the GP50T, a turbocharged or tunnel motor variant of the GP50 road switcher. This particular model was requested by the Denver, Rio Grande and Western Railroad after the success of the SD40T-2, in which the radiators were expanded for better engine cooling in mountainous areas. But before the Rio Grande could complete the designs for the GP50T, the railroad tested EMD's relatively new SD50, which, ironically despite its later to be discovered severe reliability issues, actually performed pretty well when in tunnels, thus rendering the tunnel motor series obsolete, including a proposed SD50T. Likewise, the Rio Grande eventually preferred using 6-axle power instead of 4-axle for long-distance runs, which also just so happens to be the same reasoning behind the cancellation of the next class, the GP70. Not much information is known about this class, other than that it was offered by EMD in the early 90s, but interestingly enough, no official orders were made for what was essentially a 4-axle version of the widely successful SD70 with radial trucks. This unbuilt engine is an especially painful loss, as even though many Class 1s opted for larger 6-axle engines with more horsepower, many smaller regional and short-line roads across the country have to rebuild various second-generation diesels that have been running for about 50 years, as one of the last widespread 4-axle engines made by EMD was a GP60M in 1994, as the GP70 would have been the next 4-axle model built after this, and serve as much needed reliable new 4-axle power to assist with local and switching services across the country. And because of this, some Class 1s resorted to using 6-axle GEVOs for local and switching ops. Speaking of 6-axle power, after decades of success with the mixed traffic F units and 4-axle GP road switchers, EMD eventually switched their market to the road freight 6-axle SD series, or Special Duty series, intended for hauling heavier loads with more horsepower. Just like the 4-axle models before them, various 6-axle engines were also cataloged but never built, starting off with the lowest number on the list, the SD30. It's speculated that this engine would have utilized the same unique appearance of the popular GP30, but basically with 6 axles and an extended frame. Although, no orders were purchased since the previous 6-axle engine, the SD24, was underperforming due to a recession around 1959, which didn't leave too many railroads in a favorable condition to purchase brand new engines. Yet, some speculate that the SD24 is the closest model we have to the SD30, since it had 150 more horsepower than the GP30, along with many similar mechanical components to the GP30. Oddly enough, the GP30 flipped the script, as by the time the recession ended in 1962, more railroads preferred the smaller 4-axle GP30 to replace older pre-war diesels on local duties, as the horsepower race didn't expand to larger 6-axle diesel engines just yet. Skipping ahead a few years comes the 3-in-1 entry that covers 3 variants of a lesser-known existing class, namely the SD39-2, SD39DC, and SDL39-2. As an add-on to the 1966 series of 6-axle engines listed 2 years later, the SD39 had a median horsepower of 2300 when compared to the stronger SD40 and SD45, as it also had the smallest prime mover with only 12 cylinders instead of 16, and only a total of 54 were constructed. When compared to the bases, the SD39-2 was offered with -2 upgrades including an AR-10 alternator, upgraded modular electronics, and new HTC trucks that provided more attractive adhesion to the rails. Likewise, the SDL39-2 would have similar upgrades for another SD39 variant, namely the SDL39, which only had 10 units built for the Milwaukee Road in 1969, which essentially used compressed 6-axle trucks on a 4-axle frame due to weight restrictions. Lastly, the SD39-DC, just like the SD30, was intended to be a 6-axle version of the GP39DC, which was essentially a small class of turbocharged GP38s. Despite the various variants of the SD39, most of them were never built, as the SD39-2 was never sold in favor of the more powerful SD40-2, and both the SDL39-2 and SD39DC were cancelled, since the SDL39 and GP39DC were extremely small and niche classes to begin with. Speaking of extremely small niche classes, the SD49 was soon offered as part of the 50 series in 1979 as a 6-axle variant of the GP49, a class with only 9 members built for the Alaska Railroad. Like previously mentioned cancelled classes, the SD49 was essentially a 6-axle variant of a weaker variant of the successful GP50, as the GP49 offered a 12-cylinder EMD 645 prime mover instead of the 16-cylinder counterpart of the GP50 and SD50. More so now than in the past, Class 1 railroads were looking for stronger engines that offered more horsepower and wouldn't sell for anything less. But interestingly enough, 2 SD49s were in fact built, or rather converted, as 2 Alaska Railroad GP49s were sold to Ferronor in Chile and given broad gauge 5 foot 6 inches 6-axle trucks, essentially making these engines SD49s. But given the commercial failure of the SD50 due to placing too much horsepower on the 645 prime mover, one can speculate if a lower horsepower SD49 would have been a better sale for railroads in the long run. To look further into this question and to wrap up the SD series, we have the SD55 and SD59, the latter of which was simply a catalog 6-axle variant of the GP59, with no models purchased due to the longevity of previous EMD models along with a lack of EMD orders due to the SD50's failure, while the SD55 would have utilized a 20-cylinder engine on the 645 prime mover and would have been the first engine to produce 4,200 horsepower. Although SD55 prototypes were in fact built, classified as the SD45X, with the same prime mover as the SD55, but these were experimental engines that didn't result in any sales due to reliability issues, which wasn't helped by the limited amounts of fuel caused by the oil embargo of the mid-70s. Since the GP59 used the EMD 710 prime mover, which was developed in direct response to the SD50's engine failures, the SD59 would have been the better of the 2 engines to offer, but this engine would have also been identical to the SD60, which also utilized the improved 710 prime mover with more horsepower, so you can probably figure out how this story ends. While EMD thrived through the 70s with the success of their SD40-2s and other road freight engines, their influence in the passenger industry was undeniably solidified with the F40PH, a passenger variant of the GP40 freight engine. Not only did this engine become one of the single greatest classes produced by EMD, but it also became an icon of Amtrak and passenger railroading with many originals and variants of this class still in service to this day. Although, such a massive success wasn't developed overnight, as there were allegedly plans of the F39P and the F40P before the F40PH, with both of these classes having steam heaters instead of head and power, or GP, to power the coaches. This would have been a huge step backwards as their SCP-40Fs, EMD's first attempt at passenger engines for Amtrak, were equipped with steam heaters and water tanks, which caused them to constantly derail due to uneven weight distribution, so adding steam heaters to the F39P and F40P instead of a HEP generator would have resulted in the same problems, despite the supposedly shorter frame and 4-axle wheel arrangement. On the other hand, just because an accomplishment was reached with a successful product doesn't mean that further research had stopped there, as Amtrak also contracted EMD to create another F40-like engine that would be short enough to meet the same height as our Amfleet coaches in order to fit into the North River tunnels at Penn Station, New York. Sometime in the late 70s, EMD then proposed the AMT-125, with AMT denoting Amtrak and 125 likely denoting a top speed of 125 miles per hour. Now there were likely two or many more concepts of this engine, the first of which shows an Amfleet-inspired power car on both ends of a series of Amfleet coaches. This diesel Amfleet also employed stainless steel fluting with wide airplane-like windows. But this entire concept feels too much like an airline rather than a train. Just because the Amfleets were designed to look like a plane doesn't mean you have to make the engine look like a plane too. The second known concept of the AMT-125 is a much better looking evolution of the F40PH, in which the front end is streamlined and combines the Phase 1 and Phase 2 paint schemes. Although not necessarily fitting the exact shape of the Amfleet, this concept takes the iconic EMD look to a new level with new approaches to speed and style, and would have been an equally iconic engine to serve America's passenger rail alongside the larger F40PH, which makes it especially confusing as to why this engine was never built. Unless the airline concept came after and just ruined the looks, but that's just my opinion. The more likely reasoning was that Amtrak simply ordered more F40s for service outside the Northeast, and left their Northeast corridor services running through New York to their equally reliable AEM-7s. Likewise, EMD also proposed their own concept art of an electric engine to run electrified services in the Northeast 5 years before the AEM-7 in 1973, likely as a direct response to GE releasing their electric E60 in the same year. Although some elements of the AEM-7 are clearly present, such as the use of 4 axles and a short frame, this concept is a bit more streamlined, with curves similar to the original AMT-125, 3 driver's windows, engine porthole windows, a single pantograph, a driver's door on one end instead of both, and a front door, all in a Phase 1 livery. Despite their success in diesel locomotives, they didn't have experience in electric engines, which is why they likely contracted ASEA in Sweden to eventually develop the AEM-7 a few years later. Many years later, after millions of miles in service, Amtrak announced that they were interested in retiring the venerable F40s in the late 80s, with EMD and GE expressing their interest in producing replacement engines, the former of which collaborated with Siemens to develop the F69PHAC. If successful, then EMD already had plans for releasing the production class known as the F70PHAC, which not only included sleek side skirting for Amtrak units along with a somewhat normal unit without skirting, but also included options for Amtrak's Canadian counterpart Via Rail, along with various commuter railroads such as MBTA, GO Transit, New Jersey Transit, SEPTA, and Caltrans, all with slightly different front ends with a recessed nose, number boards, and 3 headlights. But ever since the flop of the SD50 in the mid-80s, many Class 1 railroads shifted their locomotive orders from EMD to General Electric, which ultimately included Amtrak, as they selected GE's P40DC, or Genesis, to succeed the iconic F40PH. Despite its initial failure for intercity rail, its cab design was later used for the similar F40PH M-2, and its findings laid the foundation for AC traction powered engines such as the SC70 Mac, as well as future EMD commuter engines, namely the DE30AC purchased by the Long Island Railroad later in the decade. EMD's reputation for building incredible diesel engines soon led to orders being placed from around the world, with many models either being carbon copies of American counterparts or custom-made export units specifically designed for certain regions. The first few entries were simply renamed versions of their American counterparts for the sake of classification as part of a potential sale to China State Railways, with an L in the name to represent lighter trucks, namely the SDL-38-2, SDL-45-2, and SWL-1001. However, also included in this order was the unique JT-40-2, with JT designating that it's a 6-axle double-ended export model, which was essentially a Cal Unit SC40-2 with an extended cab of an F40PH. Although, none of the 4 proposed models were purchased from EMD, in favor of the C36-7 from GE, but the SDL designation would be used again, most notably on SDL-38s purchased by Saudi Railways Organization, and the JT-40's cab design would only be used on Speno maintenance variants of the F40PH. Developing from the success of the SC40-2 overseas was the British Rail Class 59, which later led to the development of the much more widespread Class 66, also known as the JT-42 CWR, this time built with a 710 prime mover and saw hundreds of units sold in Europe. After some customer feedback, EMD announced plans to develop a new variant of the successful locomotive in 2008, named the Class 66 EU, or JT42 EU. This variant would be designed for continental European operations with UIC 505-1 loading gauge, as opposed to the restricted British loading gauge, meaning the engine would be taller, as it would also be equipped with dynamic brakes and ERTMS. EMD contracted Cesar Vergara, the same person who designed the F59 PHI and the rivaling GE Genesis, to design the body of the locomotive with a smoother cab, while keeping the curved roof of the Class 66, all in a nondescript EMD livery. Despite relatively good progress being made, the project was ultimately cancelled in 2011, but many of its design elements were utilized for the Volksloop 4000, which utilizes many EMD components. Moving right along from EMD's most recent cancelled locomotive types, we're traveling back in time to one of the first export diesel model proposals in history, the Type EX. Similar to how the JT40-2 was an extended F40PH, the EX was essentially a 6-axle BL2, with a high hood on both ends, quite possibly being one of the first high hood proposals in the world in 1947. As the engine was designed to run on 5'3" broad gauge track, the EX was looked into by railroads from Brazil, Australia, and Ireland, but the CIE in Ireland was unable to secure funds to build the engine outside the US, despite being the railroad that showed the most interest in the EX. In the end, the BL2 basis of the EX would soon be replaced by the much more successful GP7 2 years later, which would therefore lead to EMD's first actual export unit, that being the G12 built in 1953. Also catalogued in this group of export engines was the G6, which supposedly did not use the same frame as the G8 or G12, but had a 6-cylinder 567 prime mover, and another class simply known as the R, which was a 6-axle export engine with a 12-cylinder 567 prime mover and internal components of a SD18. Although, information on these catalogued export engines is little to none, other than that the G6 is not the same as the Victorian Railway's G6-B. Speaking of the land down under, many EMD designs were produced and altered under the licensing of Clyde Engineering Works, as they notably modified the iconic EMD E8 into the Commonwealth Railway's GM class. Likewise, 2 of their concepts were directly based on EMD models, so they're also included in this video, namely the AT20D and A32D. Both of these models were proposed in 1966 as 8-axle variants of the GM class, or E8, with the AT20D having a 3600 horsepower turbocharged 20-cylinder 645 prime mover, and the A32D having two 16-cylinder 567 or 645 prime movers in one locomotive, producing 3600 or 4000 horsepower respectively. Although not much is known about these massive proposals, other than being rejected in favor of more GM class engines, they did pave the way for the successful CL class 4 years later, and it leads right into the Megaprojects section of this episode. Picking up right from the exports category, we have another 8-axle double-engine proposal back in the States, the DD40A. Similar to the DD35A predecessor, this engine would simply be 2 GP40s on a single frame instead of 2 GP35s, which included two 645 prime movers that produced 3,300 horsepower each, when compared to the DD35A's two 567 prime movers at 2,500 horsepower each. Even though this class also included improvements learned from the DD35A's shortcomings, the DD40A was soon replaced with the further improved DD40AX, which utilized many features of the DD40A, with the exception of a wide cab. This engine would later become the most powerful diesel engine built on a single frame at 6,600 horsepower, and outlasting earlier high horsepower engines from other manufacturers on Union Pacific, with several examples in preservation. Despite being a neglected intermediate between a maintenance nightmare and an upgraded powerhouse, this unbuilt model gained much more fame in model form, as Athearn made HO scale models of the DD40A in an EMD demonstrator livery, as well as the Baltimore and Ohio, Burlington, Pennsylvania, Southern Pacific, and Union Pacific. Developing on the DD40A concept comes the next entry, the DDR6700. Instead of running on diesel fuel and having a single cab, this mighty locomotive would have a cab on both ends and run on overhead electricity with 6,700 horsepower, likely utilizing a DD40A frame and SD45 shells. Many train enthusiasts have claimed that this beast was a Conrail proposal, as they were the last railroad that utilized electric freight service, and it would have coincided with the demand by freight railroads to electrify due to the oil embargo of the mid-70s. What many don't know is that this concept predates the oil embargo by almost a full decade, as the build date on a larger view of the drawing reads Proposal for Pennsylvania Railroad, December 1966. This was the last of many proposed engines specifically designed or requested by the Pennsy, who will eventually be getting an episode of their own. But the DDR 6700 was included in this episode since it's directly based on existing EMD designs, and it was likely sketched by EMD in direct response to GE's E44 freight engine for the same railroad a few years prior. Even though this electric engine would have been the most powerful locomotive on the rails and showcased the might of overhead wire-powered locomotives, the Pennsy, like other northeastern railroads at the time, wasn't in a financially favorable position to undertake such an expensive project, especially upon the looming merger with the New York Central to create the infamous Penn Central. Furthermore, multiple modifications to the track would be necessary to hold such a massive engine, as they were struggling just to maintain their existing infrastructure, but many still argue that building such an engine would have done wonders for not just the Pensy's freight traffic, but also for the greater American rail network by setting a new, stronger, and cleaner standard for American locomotive design. Last but not least is an almost forgotten concept that was developed not too long ago and has a lot more than 8 axles, which looks unlike that of anything in EMD's history. Are you ready? Here we go. In 2002, EMD created a scale model for the FRA known as the Advanced Concept Train, or ACT, which is to date EMD's only high-speed train. Yes, indeed, the mighty EMD did in fact propose their very own high-speed train set, although information on this ambiguous train set was little to none. The only way I found out about this model was by scrolling through 3 years of posts from a Facebook page using reverse image search that provided a broken link, and then web archived the link to find the unopenable photo in an assortment of other image files. After looking through some of the pages, I thankfully found a single web archive of the article that supposedly contained the photos of the ACT, stating that the project was developed at GM's Advanced Design Studio located in North Hollywood, California, which usually designs various concept schemes for the many automobiles of General Motors, since EMD was a division of GM at the time. Otherwise, we do know that this concept HST was designed in response to a bid from the Federal Railroad Administration, or FRA, to design a new series of high-speed train sets upon the recent release of the Acela Express, as part of an interest to start various high-speed rail corridors in the US since the 90s. Although it's unknown as to what the full set would consist of, the model that was presented to EMD had a total of a whopping 18 axles, with the prime mover supposedly split into the first 3 sections, each sitting upon a 3-axle truck to better navigate curves, with a red container behind the engine, although it's unknown if this is meant to carry passengers or freight. Also interesting to note is that the ACT was designed by GM around the same time as another concept car, namely the GM Autonomy, whose sleek silver design could have somewhat inspired the cab design on the ACT. Despite the massive scope of GM's only concept high-speed train to date, the project was never fully developed for some time, especially after legal disputes regarding the software to be utilized for the ACT a few years later, as information for this project has been scarce ever since. Electro Motive Diesel eventually split off from GM in 2005 as it was sold to Berkshire Partners, and EMD would go through a much more substantial change when they were purchased by Progress Rail, or Caterpillar, in 2010, resulting in brand new prime movers and a new series of locomotive designs with varying levels of success. Even though many classes never left the drawing boards, they still played a role in EMD's legacy, as their research led to the development of more perfected finished products. But through a full century of legendary locomotives during their highs and lows, one can only wonder how the course of the company and railroading as we know it would have been changed if any one of these engines were ever built. But before we wrap up this episode, it's only right to cover a few honorable mentions, starting with original concept art for the EMD E5. Although it's technically not an unbuilt class, it combined the early concept of the Burlington Roots Pioneer Zephyr with the more recent E-Series cab, although the final E5 design would continue the more traditional E-Series cab, likely for ease of use. Next is the ambitious GF60 concept art. which was essentially a 6-axle electric F40PH. Proposed in the late 70s, when many railroads were considering electrification, double-ended proposals were also sketched for the Ferrocarriles Nacionales de Mexico, but the only railroad to place an order was BC Rail, who purchased 7 units for their newly electrified segments, which utilized unique upgraded cabs when compared to the F40. On the topic of canceled electric engines is the dual-mode New Jersey Transit engine, being proposed in both white and blue paint schemes, but this locomotive was supposedly never given an official class name, and would have also been named a DM30AC, as this engine lost the dual-mode contract for NJT to the Bombardier ALP45. Also offered around this time was an electric ST40-2T, or electric tunnel motor. This was part of a 1981 FRA study with interest from a lot of railroads that offered to convert existing EMD engines, in this case an ST40-2T, to run on overhead catenary. This was an especially tough decision to place this unique engine on the honorable mention list instead of having its own section, but since this proposal was simply a rebuild and didn't actually designate a class name, I decided to include it as a noteworthy addition to an interesting time in American railroading. Lastly is the GP2000, which despite being a new class, it was technically a new rebuild program proposed by EMD in exchange for more SC60s for Norfolk Southern in the early 90s. Although, there isn't any known concept art of this proposed rebuild, and it would have essentially rebuilt unspecified 4-axle engines into GP59 equivalents, which NS ultimately opted out of, but the program did pave the way for more rebuild programs such as the GP22 Eco. Are there any unbuilt EMD engines that I missed in this episode, or are there other unbuilt engines that you would like to see covered in the series? Feel free to comment below, and I'll see where they can fit into future episodes. Special thanks to the Electromotive Builder Photos Facebook page for providing sketches and background info regarding many of these proposed engines. Thank you all for watching. Credit for all the photos used go to their respective photographers, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Have a good day.